William Osler, widely regarded as the father of modern medicine, once said, "Every one of you will have to face the ordeal of every student in this generation who sooner or later tries to mix the waters of science with the oil of faith. You can have a good deal of both if you only keep them separate. The worry comes from the attempt at a mixture." Today it seems medical training mirrors Osler's warning. There remains a popular assumption that biological and spiritual flourishing can be cleanly distinguished, leading to the belief that it is best to keep separate the life of faith from the life of science, especially in clinical practice. Yet it is also true that religious considerations in medicine have received newfound attention in recent years, including the topics of prayer with patients, the extent to which physicians should seek to respect and accommodate the religious traditions of their patients, and even how theological virtues like courage, forbearance, and hope are in great need of revival in modern medicine. Evidence tells us that a surprising majority of patients in fact desire their physicians to engage their religious and spiritual concerns, yet most never receive such attention, especially in the end of life when such care would seem most warranted. Alarmingly, as physicians Aparna Sajja and Christina Pachalski have written, modern medical training is falling short of preparing physicians to help patients with the metaphysical needs of their illness. Of course, there remain those who would rather exclude religious reasoning from medical decision-making altogether. Some ethicists and philosophers have cited the primacy of public reason in medicine, suggesting that physicians serve in roles closely resembling those of public officials. As such, the physician as public official ought to limit herself to public reason for her decision-making, meaning not only those considerations that any reasonable person could recognize, but also those that preclude the use of religious considerations. Yet we recognize, as the philosopher Thomas Nagel famously put it, there is actually no view from nowhere. Every form of reason is grounded in particular persons, places, and contexts. The very idea of a public reason devoid of religious consideration is itself a particular moral philosophy, dependent on a particular person, place, and context. Thus, the opposition of public reason to religious reason is simply the preference of one form of reasoning against another. In fact, the claim that theological considerations have no place in medicine can itself be thought of as a particular theological claim. This is because, as physician and ethicist Loris Calgin writes, religious and philosophical beliefs that make moral claims cannot ultimately be distinguished, as they both serve as foundational frameworks for ethical situations. The best that clinicians can do is openly deliberate about how each foundation does or does not seek properly the health of the patient, rather than throwing off religious foundations altogether. Indeed, the very idea that religious reasoning should be avoided while making decisions on behalf of the sick is a curious one, as it neglects the extent to which modern assumptions about the sick are born of a religious reasoning tradition. The desire to care for the sick is in fact a radical moral commitment with deep roots in theological worldviews that demand the protection of the vulnerable, most notably represented in the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian traditions. In the Jewish tradition, for example, special attention is given to practicing presence with the suffering, called sitting Shiva, and rescuing life, Pekuah Nefesh. In the Islamic tradition, Muslims are called to show kindness to the weak and the sick as one of the greatest, dearest, and highest honors before Allah. And as the late bioethicist Alan Verhey pointed out, it's unlikely the Hippocratic tradition would have grown the way it did were it not for Christianity's influence. In fact, early pagan observers in the first few centuries described Christianity as a religion for the sick, precisely because they recognized that something profound and unique was happening as Christians stayed behind in cities ravaged by plagues to attend to the sick, care for the poor, and even rescue discarded infants. These early Christians pioneered a new concept of philanthropy, which focused on the least of these, rather than on the welfare of the city, the health of the elite, the reputation of the philanthropists, or the precepts of public reason. More important than these historical examples, though, is the fact that the moral charge to care for the sick is not an imperative reached by public rationality alone. Alternative public reason may advocate for the preference and propagation of the strong and fit over the weak and disabled in a way that some may find not only rationally intelligible, but ethically persuasive, as was argued during the height of the eugenics movement here in America and in the era of Nazi medicine. Finally, the most important reason that medicine and theology cannot be cleanly separated is because claims in support of this separation misunderstand the moral nature of medicine. Medicine is not merely the making of decisions based on current medical science, and physicians are not merely public officials responsible for evidence dissemination. Such a perspective is profoundly reductive, as if all that is at stake in a clinical encounter is the neutral articulation of up-to-date facts. Medicine is instead a moral practice, dealing with the interfacing of moral agents as mutually fragile and dependent beings who are often marked by profound vulnerability. Therefore, medicine requires not just current science, but cultivated virtues, such as patience, compassion, and wisdom for its excellent practice. The trust inherent in this relationship does not deal merely with the conveyance of accurate information. A peer-reviewed database can surely serve that function. Rather, the trust-based nature of the patient-physician relationship means that sick and suffering patients entrust not merely the facts of their disease process, but also a core part of themselves to the physicians caring for them. Such a reality calls the physician to a higher standard than mere informational integrity. It calls her to be something like what Aristotle called a moral friend, who takes seriously the moral, biological, and spiritual life of her patients. The very idea that health constitutes a core element of the good life is a moral belief that informs the practice of medicine. Indeed, it is impossible to separate one's conception of a good life from one's role as a doctor. This means that physicians who are insistent on public rationality, stripped of spiritual and religious content for all medical decisions, are in fact employing a form of religiosity, one faithful to a specific way of knowing the world and suggestive of its own moral commitments. Thus, by the very nature of the practice of medicine and their place in it, physicians cannot cease doing theology, but rather ought to seek to do better theology. Importantly, doing theology wisely is not synonymous with ill-timed evangelism, preaching, or manipulation. The use of religious language when dealing with medical decisions need not be as crass or patently ineffective as is so often parodied. Doing theology well in medicine, especially for Christians, probably means a willingness to simply share a word about God, the definition of the word theology, in the first place, and to do so with deep and rich habits of listening, respect, and charity. As resident physicians, we have found that at times, it takes sincere engagement with the beliefs of our patients to make good medical decisions. We've each had patients open up religious considerations in the clinical space, and it was only in doing theology, sometimes not even with words, that we were able to seek a course of health that was both consistent with current medical science and faithful to the patient's desires for a good life. Just as there are no atheists in foxholes, there are no atheists in white coats. Our charge as Christians is to recognize the deep moral worth of the work before us and to learn to be good stewards of the word God has given us as we serve those who entrust us with their care.